In October 1956, Yuri Andropov, the Soviet ambassador in Hungary, watched from his office window as the uprising was unfolding. Tens of thousands of people went to the streets of Budapest to demand freedom. The Hungarian Revolution was crushed by Soviet tanks, but Andropov heeded the lesson. In 1967, Yuri Andropov was appointed chairman of the KGB and founded the notorious 5th Directorate tasked with suppressing dissent. Every anti-Soviet action represents a danger, Andropov said. He was convinced that even the smallest attempt to subvert the communist ideological monopoly could have unpredictable consequences for the regime.
I saw archived documents of the Communist Party Central Committee and the Politburo. And judging by those documents, they took dissent very seriously. Everything to do with us was decided only on the Politburo level. I sometimes laugh and say that even if we hadn't done anything else, this alone would have been an achievement. Because those 15 or 13 very old people met every week to decide the fate of the world, and we took away their time. They had to decide whom to search, whom to arrest, and so on. Seriously speaking, though, they understood very well what effect our movement was having on the country. And it scared them greatly. Surveillance, or perhaps it would be better to say tracking, in the Soviet Union was done in two ways. Two strong men would approach you on the street, grab you and say, "You bastard, dog's meat, do you want us to rip your legs out?" This would go on for an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. Then it could be on any street or at any metro station. There would be a transfer point. Two other men would approach you and say, "Volodya, you're a great guy. You can work. We can arrange an apartment in Moscow for you. Just let us know." And this would go on for another 2 or 3 hours.
Once I punctured my tire. It is physically hard for me to replace it. I know how to do it. I completed the courses for taxi drivers, so I know how to do everything. But it is physically hard. So I hired a truck driver to replace my tire for 3 or 5 rubles. But the KGB agents who were following me said no. I said, "Okay, let's stay here for the night." I had a blanket in my car anyway. Then the KGB agents phoned somewhere and said, "Okay, you can hire someone." And one of them stood next to me and watched as a truck driver changed my tire. When he changed my tire, I wanted to give him 3 rubles, but he said, "Keep your money, lady. And as for this guy, he must be taught a lesson. Can he not change a tire?" He must have thought that this KGB agent was my son. So I said to him, "This guy is not with me. He's with the Committee for State Security."
I was imprisoned at the Lubyanka. That prison was closed around 1965, so I was one of the last people to stay there. I was in solitary confinement. On the 3rd day of my imprisonment, the guards took me to see General Svetlichny, head of the Moscow KGB. His office was at the former mansion of Count Rostopchin, which was connected by a covered walkway with the Moscow KGB building. So they took me to that mansion. Svetlichny said very simply, "Here is a warrant for your arrest. If you tell us honestly who gave you that book and to whom you gave it to read, I won't sign it, and you will go home. If you don't tell us, I will sign it, and you will go to prison. So what will it be?" I found his question insulting, so I cursed at him. He didn't say anything. He just shook his head, signed the arrest warrant, and told the guards to take me away.
1968 was a crucial year for the Russian dissident movement. The Prague Spring, reforms initiated by the new leadership of Czechoslovakia under Alexander Dubček, raised hopes for a gradual democratization of the entire Soviet bloc. These hopes were dashed in an instant. On the 21st of August 1968, Soviet tanks rolled into the streets of Prague.
There were no newspapers at the train station in Leningrad. No Pravda, no Izvestia, nothing. I saw that the person sitting next to me was reading a newspaper. It was Leningradskaya Pravda, which did get published on that day. I asked to have a look at it because there were no other newspapers. He said yes, most newspapers did not come out today because our troops have entered Czechoslovakia. I received a phone call at 6 in the morning from Pyotr Yakir, a dissident. He told me that our troops had invaded Czechoslovakia and that foreign radio stations were being jammed. For about the previous 5 years, they were not jamming the radio stations. They were jamming Radio Liberty, but not the Voice of America and the BBC. We tried to listen to the radio, but we couldn't hear anything. The same morning they invaded Czechoslovakia, they began to jam the radio signals.
4 days after the invasion of Czechoslovakia, on the 25th of August 1968, 7 people came out into Red Square in Moscow in a silent demonstration of protest at the suppression of the Prague Spring. Their names would be remembered as an example of civic courage in the face of an all-powerful, repressive state.
For me, and maybe for others too, I cannot speak for them, going to that demonstration was a selfish move. I wanted to have a clean conscience.
At noon, with the last strike of the clock on the Kremlin Spasskaya Tower, we sat down on Red Square, at the Place of Skulls, where in ancient times executions were carried out. We sat down, and those of us who had posters raised them above our heads. I raised my poster. One side read, "Freedom for Dubček," and the other, "Down with the occupiers." My poster read, "For your freedom and ours." It was my favorite slogan. It comes from the Russian writer Alexander Yesenin, who raised this toast with the Poles when he was an émigré in London. This comparison, this connection between different generations of the Russian Revolution was very important for us.
A nation minus even one person is no longer an entire nation. A nation minus me is not an entire nation. A nation minus 10, 100, 1,000 people is not an entire nation. So they could no longer say that there was nationwide approval in the Soviet Union for the invasion of Czechoslovakia.
We sat down. At that moment, there were 10 or 12 passers-by near the Place of Skulls. The KGB agents who had been following us were not there. As soon as we sat down and raised our posters, we heard shouting from all directions, and we saw around 10 people running toward us. There were women with large bags. A KGB woman with a heavy bag, which was filled, as somebody suggested, with bricks. I suspected it was filled with books, not with bricks. She hit me on the head with it. I began to fight back with my feet while still sitting down, and one of the KGB agents hit me on the teeth with a knuckle duster, and 4 teeth fell out into my hand. Cars drove out from the Kremlin Spasskaya gate. Everyone began pushing. Gorbanevskaya had brought a stroller with her 2 children. They tried to throw one of the children into the car. She began to scream. All this time, the KGB agents were running around, taking away cameras from the passers-by. There was great commotion. No one knew what to do. After all, it wasn't every day that we had demonstrations like this in the Soviet Union. A doctor came to examine my teeth. He began to write his report. "The teeth have been removed." "Not removed," I said. "Knocked out." He then wrote, "outside of the home," or "on the street." I said, "Not outside of the home, in Red Square." At the trial, not one of us admitted guilt. We all insisted that we were acting in accordance with the Soviet Constitution by protesting against the decision of the Soviet government with which we disagreed. We were handed different sentences. I received 5 years of internal exile. Larisa Bogoraz received 4 years of internal exile. Konstantin Babitsky received 3 years of internal exile. Vadim Delonay and Vladimir Dremlyuga each received 3 years in prison camps.
2 of the participants of the Red Square demonstration, Viktor Fainberg and Natalia Gorbanevskaya, were not sent to a camp or to a prison or into internal exile. The Soviet regime had invented a different, as it thought, a more effective method of fighting its political opponents. Dissenters were declared mentally insane and without any trial committed to psychiatric prisons.
Around 1959, during one of his visits abroad, Khrushchev was asked if there were political prisoners in the Soviet Union. People in the West thought that all political prisoners were released after the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, which was not true. And Khrushchev said, "No, we do not have political prisoners. Our people are united in support of the government. We only have the criminals and the mentally insane."
Starting under Khrushchev, and especially under Brezhnev, with such an enterprising person as Andropov at the head of the KGB, this system became more structured. At first, there were 2 psychiatric prisons, which were later euphemistically called special psychiatric hospitals. There was one such special hospital in Leningrad and one in Kazan. Later, as I remember, there were 12 of them.
This was a psychiatric prison. All the regulations were the same as they would be in an ordinary prison. And then there was also treatment. Some medicines did not exist in 1960 or in 1963. For example, a medicine called haloperidol. Vladimir Bukovsky, when he was in a psychiatric prison, was not treated with haloperidol. I was. This is a medicine to combat hallucinations, to combat voices, that is, auditory hallucinations, and delirium. In a normal clinic, a patient is given this medicine for a month, and then the doctors assess whether it has worked. This medicine has a side effect that made it so valuable to punitive psychiatry. It causes the same symptoms as Parkinson's disease.
There are many people who would be willing to die for their beliefs, but not many would be willing to lose their mind. That was a risk that frightened people.
Every morning you test yourself. Have you already lost your mind or not yet? Needless to say, the very fact of asking yourself this question every morning weakens your mental health. Are you still healthy or not? Maybe you've already begun to lose it but haven't noticed. I was constantly tortured by one thought. How long will I stay here? Because when you're sent to a prison camp, you have a sentence, but there's no sentence for treatment. When will I be released? More importantly, what will I be when I'm released? When I do regain my freedom, will I be able to understand that it is freedom? Will I know the difference between freedom and prison?
The benefit of this practice for Soviet leaders was that they could present it to the West as simply treating sick people, not punishing dissenters. They could also keep a person locked up without trial for as long as they wanted. In almost every Western country, in Europe, in America, in Canada, psychiatrists formed organizations that protested against the Soviet punitive psychiatry. Western psychiatrists took this issue very seriously, and they demanded that their association presidents take a firm stand against the Soviet Union and call for its expulsion from the World Psychiatric Association. In 1977, when I was already in the West, the World Psychiatric Association condemned the Soviet practice, and in 1983, it was ready to expel the Soviets. But they left of their own accord. So we achieved a full victory on this issue.
For Soviet dissidents, moral support from democratic countries was important not only in addressing the issue of punitive psychiatry. Starting in the 1970s, the West, and above all the United States of America, placed human rights and the Soviet Union on the international agenda.
Even if we had no support from the West, our activities would still have had moral significance. But they would not have had the same resonance, and they would have slipped into obscurity. There were people in Stalin's time who organized protest groups, but nobody knew about them. They did not become a fact. Support from the West was important above all because it gave a sense that something was happening, and because people learned about us. Western governments couldn't do anything about human rights violations in the Soviet Union unless there was information from people inside the Soviet Union. Otherwise, action would have been unlawful. The Soviet government would have said, "Why do you claim that we are violating human rights? We aren't, and you have no proof." The West needed proof. And then there was the conference in Helsinki, at which on August 1st, 1975, 35 countries agreed to recognize each other's political rights. In effect, Europe had recognized the borders of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. The free world had officially and legally recognized the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. Second, there was an agreement on economic cooperation, in which the Soviet Union was also very interested. And the third basket of the Helsinki Accords was about human rights. Because the Soviet Union formally adhered to these human rights pacts, we began to demand that they implement them. This was a much stronger demand than the demand to abide by the Soviet Constitution, because the international pacts were much less ambiguous. And Soviet leaders could not say that these pacts were made for South Africa and for Chile, but not for the Soviet Union. They wanted to be respected by the whole world, and that's why those international pacts were so important. From that moment on, the Soviet Union could not make a single step without the entire world examining its human rights record under a microscope.
The Russian dissident movement did not have leaders, subordinates, or organized structures, but from the 1970s on, the world press increasingly mentioned the name of academician Andrei Sakharov. For many Soviet dissidents, Sakharov became a symbolic and consolidating figure.
Every one of his statements made a difference. First of all, they attracted the attention of people in the West and of the Western human rights community to the specific problems of specific people in the Soviet Union. And this, to some extent, made the lives of these people easier.
Sakharov was utterly honest in everything. He told the truth, even when the truth was unfavorable to himself or to his friends. A great scientist who had reached the very top of the Soviet elite, who had received the most awards from the Soviet state, began to write that no scientific creativity and no progress will be possible in this country without the freedom of thought.
Documents of the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party that were declassified in 1991 show that the country's top leadership monitored every demonstration of dissent. In his memorandum to the Central Committee in December 1970, Andropov affirmed that the Soviet Union now had a political opposition.
Our goal was freedom. Our freedom, but without forgetting such things as conscience. and responsibility. Freedom, conscience, and responsibility. These were the foundations of everything we did.
Такие столпы всего, что мы делали.
The goal of the Soviet authorities was not just to arrest the dissident and to isolate him. They spent years and invested great efforts to force such a person to say publicly that he was wrong and that the Soviet government was right. That was the essence of the Soviet regime's fight against dissent. I never once had a thought that I was doing something wrong. Not once in my life. I knew that what I was doing was supported by a great number of people. It was just that not everyone was ready to say it openly. When I talked to people privately, they agreed with my opinions. So I knew that I was right. And that's the most important knowledge. When you know that you are right, you stop being afraid.
Никакого страха не остается.